Thank you so much, Dr. Lane, and thank you, Father Woodall. It's wonderful to have you with us this evening, and thank you all for turning out. I should add my voice to the litany of thanks by commending the congenial faculty here in the Department of English, Dr. Lane for being such a gracious host, Dr. Tracy for helping to sponsor and organize this lecture. And I want to thank all of you at Christendom. This is my first visit to campus, and it has been delightful. It has been splendid, full of bucolic warmth and nice weather and lovely autumn colors. I come from a place that doesn't have nice weather and doesn't have autumn. In Houston, Texas, where I live, there are only 2 seasons, 9 months of summer and 3 months of indecision. So this has been a real treat, a real blessing. Thank you very much. I have provided a handout, which is not really necessary to follow the lecture. It will be perhaps a convenient point of reference for a few events that I may discuss in the course of these remarks. I provided the handout only as an excuse not to come up with a PowerPoint. You know, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts pointedly, and I don't need any more corruption. So thank you very much. Well, tomorrow, October 31st, is Halloween, which also happens to be Reformation Day. Spooky, huh? The holiday Protestants celebrate in commemoration of the moment 508 years ago when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church of Wittenberg in 1517, thereby setting in motion the events that would fracture Christendom, not the college, the culture, and subvert the presumptive unity of the Christian faith. And then, on the day after tomorrow, on All Saints' Day, November 1st, our Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV, will confirm St. John Henry Newman as the 38th Doctor of the Universal Church. And Newman, of course, was the saint who was raised Protestant, but who rallied his Anglican co-religionists to rediscover their Catholic roots all before he converted to the Catholic Church in 1845, after his leadership of the Oxford movement would creatively transform the character of the Anglican ecclesial body he left behind. My talk this evening unfolds amid the ironies and anomalies linking these 2 days, these 2 commemorations, of Luther and of Newman, so seemingly opposed, so at odds, yet also strangely, dynamically, perhaps even providentially interconnected. I should like to discuss the intriguing phenomenon of Anglican patrimony in Catholic communion. This reality has been made possible by Pope Benedict XVI's bold ecclesial venture as chartered in his 2009 apostolic constitution, Anglicanorum Coetibus. This document offers groups of Anglicans, converts to the Catholic faith, in the fullness of Catholic doctrine and communion, the special privilege of retaining their distinctive liturgical, pastoral, and spiritual traditions, while at the same time contributing to the evangelizing mandate of the Universal Church. I have entitled my talk, Anglican Patrimony and Catholic Communion, Problem, Gift, Challenge, and Mission, and I should like to offer some historical and experiential reflections on each dimension, particularly in an American context and with reference to American history. First, Anglican patrimony in Catholic communion presents a problem of definition and discernment, with due attention to distinguishing between the specific patrimony supervised by church authority and discipline, and what I want to call the more ambient patrimony that must be embodied and lived out by ordinariate Catholics themselves. Second, this patrimony is a gift, given and received, as so described and called by Benedict XVI, a treasure to be shared with the wider church. But third, the receiving of this gift and the sharing of this treasure entails a challenge of adjustment, worked out by the very repatriation of what was once Anglican tradition, including the seeds of grace scattered among rocks and thorns, but now brought home to the Church's own good soil, and to the supervision of the Church's magisterial authority for a more abundant harvest. Hence, I want to touch on what happens when Anglican patrimony and Catholic communion ceases to be merely Anglican and becomes fully, authentically Catholic in its own right, configuring a mission for evangelistic fruitfulness. As we shall see, the story I aim to tell this evening is the story of some creative minorities, little bands of mavericks among both Anglicans and Catholics, those committed against the odds of contributing to the reunion of the one true Church. This phrase, creative minority, comes from the historian Arnold Toynbee, who argued that very often the real engines of historical change often derive from small groups of countercultural pioneers, those dismissed as outliers or oddballs, but who plot important trajectories of development, whether for good or for ill. The notion, moreover, of creative minorities was also a key motif in the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, in his reflections on prospects for renewing the Church and revitalizing the faith in a secular age. But before explaining the background and context of Pope Benedict's Anglicanorum Coetibus and the establishment in the Catholic Church of 3 personal ordinariates for former Anglicans and also for those evangelized through their witness, before hastening to the problem, gift, challenge, and mission, let me return for a moment to the commemoration of Luther's Reformation Day and Cardinal Newman's elevation as a doctor of the Universal Church. On one hand, there is Luther's commencement of the so-called Protestant Reformation, with its radical critique of Catholic order and sacramental theology, a revolution that provoked the King of England, Henry VIII, when he was still zealously Catholic, to refute Luther and pen his Defense of the Seven Sacraments in 1521. But this same king would then, a little more than a decade later, break England's communion with the Catholic Church, have himself declared supreme head of the Church of England in 1534, and thereby unwittingly open his kingdom to the very heretical doctrines he once hoped to keep at bay. But for his Catholic zeal and loyalty to the Church of Rome against Luther, Pope Leo X named Henry Defender of the Faith, an honor later revoked when Henry was excommunicated by another pope, Paul III, in 1538. And yet this title, Defender of the Faith, was conferred on Henry again, this time by the English Parliament in 1543, and thence passed on to Henry's successors even to this day. According to the constitutional settlement issuing from the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, all English monarchs are styled defenders of the faith, regardless of their theological commitments and religious tastes, just as long as the faith they defend is not Catholic. On the other hand, there is St. John Henry Newman, newly named Doctor of the Universal Church, here some 6 years after his canonization in 2019. Newman, perhaps the most illustrious convert to the church that the Church has known since St. Augustine of Hippo, was made a saint and named a great teacher of the Catholic faith, largely on the strength of his witness and his ideas. But these ideas and this witness were first forged and developed outside of the visible communion of the Catholic Church, well before his own conversion in 1845, when he was still an uneasy adherent of the Protestant state church established by Henry VIII. But his was a summons to his fellow Anglicans to reclaim their Catholic roots and identity, despite the rupture of the 16th century. Newman manifestly failed in that project of summoning his church back to its Catholic identity. But even after his defection to Rome, the Oxford movement he helped set in motion worked its way through the Anglican Church and did so in ways that Luther would have found appalling and repugnant. The rags of popishness that somehow persisted in the Anglican Church, despite centuries of schism, waves of heresy, and bouts of iconoclasm, these rags of popishness were reknit and freshly laundered to give self-described Anglo-Catholics not only their fiddleback chasubles, but also their Catholic aspirations. The creative zeal of these Catholic-minded Anglicans fueled their wishful thinking, their pretense, and fed their illusion that Ecclesia Anglicana and its colonial offshoots always were, or could be again, a vital branch of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That wishful thinking, that pretense or illusion, however foolish or eccentric it might have seemed at the time, nevertheless wormed its way into the hearts and imaginations of countless ecclesial pilgrims who found in their own Anglican experience a providential way station before a summons to fuller, truer Catholic conversion. In the meantime, Newman brought with him into the Catholic Church his own special English sensibility, what Manning called, not altogether approvingly, that old Anglican patristic literary Oxford tone. This tone, this sensibility and disposition, has now been received into the Church and blessed as a vital dimension of Anglican patrimony in Catholic communion. This little sketch, in a nutshell, suggests the kind of ecclesial discernment, the sort of historical judgment, and the mode of spiritual instinct that moved Pope Benedict XVI to issue his apostolic constitution, Anglicanorum Coetibus. 16 years ago, with the publication of this apostolic constitution in November 2009, Pope Benedict XVI signaled a bold new commitment to the cause of Christian unity. Responding to repeated and insistent petitions from groups of Anglicans seeking reunion with the Holy See, while retaining their distinctive liturgical, spiritual, and pastoral traditions, this apostolic constitution provided for those Anglicans who desire to enter into the full communion of the Catholic Church in a corporate manner. Anglicanorum Coetibus offered these groups of Anglican converts to the Church a canonical framework for the establishment of personal ordinariates as structures juridically comparable to dioceses. The document also made provision to ordain married former Anglican clergymen to the Catholic priesthood with a special dispensation from the discipline of celibacy, at least for one generation. The document also provided for the development of a variant of the Roman Rite composed from the liturgical books proper to the Anglican tradition. And it provided as well for the erection of parishes, institutes of religious life, and houses of formation, all with the express purpose of reclaiming, maintaining, and perpetuating in the Catholic Church the Anglican patrimony as a precious gift nourishing the faith and a treasure to be shared. The Apostolic Constitution is breathtaking in its apparently positive evaluation of a religious tradition which derived from the Protestant Reformation and which developed outside the visible communion of the Church. Without mentioning the historical realities of heresy and schism, long-standing doctrinal laxity, or the modern controversies that continue to roil the Anglican communion, Pope Benedict quoted Lumen Gentium to affirm many elements of sanctification and truth in the Anglican tradition as gifts properly belonging to the Church of Christ, and as forces impelling toward Catholic unity. The three ordinariates established by Pope Benedict all adhere to the Catechism of the Catholic Church as the standard for doctrine and morals. But otherwise, the Apostolic Constitution leaves ample scope for discerning, interpreting, and repatriating the Anglican liturgical, spiritual, and pastoral heritage in unity with the Church. While speaking of mutual enrichment, the exchange of gifts, and shared treasure, Anglicanorum Coetibus tellingly does not venture to define this Anglican patrimony with any specificity or precision. The concept of Anglican patrimony poses a problem of definition and discernment. The Anglican identity worthy of maintaining in the Catholic Church is multifaceted and defies easy formulation. It resides not so much in the institutional structures, nor in the abstraction called Anglicanism, whatever that may be, but rather it inheres in the gifts, sensibilities, the ethos, indeed the stories of those Anglicans who lived through heterodoxy, ambiguity, and compromise, yet found themselves carried along by way of the scattered elements of sanctification and truth in their own tradition, drawing them toward Catholic unity. From its beginnings in the 16th century, the Anglican religious settlement, worked out under Elizabeth I, contended over in the 17th century, and then consolidated after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, has consisted in an uneasy tension between two contrary, competing energies. On one hand, there has always been a centrifugal tendency, often aggressively anti-Catholic in character, and strikingly Protestant in disposition, yet moving in liberalizing, latitudinarian directions toward ever broader accommodation with the spirit of the age. But on the other hand, at the same time, this tendency has contended with a centripetal energy toward the center of Catholic unity, summoning Anglicans back to their origins in the Roman Church and forward to prospective reunion with the Apostolic See. Assessing this heritage in view of the Apostolic Constitution requires a special historical perspective. The revised complementary norms of Anglicanorum Coetibus offer an important hermeneutic key for characterizing the legitimate Anglican patrimony worthy of repatriating to Catholic communion, as inhering in those elements of Anglican liturgical and pastoral experience that have, as the document puts it, nourished the Catholic faith throughout the history of the Anglican tradition and prompted aspirations toward ecclesial unity. In the years since the issuing of Anglicanorum Coetibus, attention has focused mostly on England and the legacy of British Anglicanism, particularly the Catholic revival within the Anglican tradition flowing from the 19th century Oxford movement. This emphasis is entirely justified. After all, an important impetus for promulgating the Constitution derived from the legacy of the Oxford movement and the witness of those English Anglo-Catholics who had been praying for Catholic unity for more than a century. Taking a wide historical view and noting several moments of promising but unrealized rapprochement between the Catholic Church and the Church of England, Father Michael Rear wrote an article just days after the publication of the Apostolic Constitution, saying, "This offer was 400 years in the making." And you'll be glad to know I'm not going to review all 400 years of the making of the document. Rather, I'd like to focus this evening on the specifically American contribution to the making of the Apostolic Constitution, and to discern how the Anglican experience in America has significantly shaped the Catholic Church's remarkable openness to repatriating elements of the Anglican heritage. Though the phenomenon of Anglicans seeking to preserve their identity in full communion with Rome is global in reach, and while we should not discount the formative influences from England or the distinctive character of the Anglican ethos in Canada and Australia, without a doubt, Americans have paved the way. Indeed, the experimental prototype for Anglicanorum Coetibus was devised by the Holy See specifically for America some 45 years ago, with Pope St. John Paul II's 1980 pastoral provision for an Anglican common identity in the Catholic Church, which instituted a special Anglican usage of the Roman Rite and authorized American Catholic bishops to erect Anglican use personal parishes in their dioceses. The pastoral provision yielded a couple hundred Catholic priests from the ranks of former Anglican clergymen and resulted in a handful of so-called Anglican use parishes across the United States, interestingly concentrated in Texas. We do it better in Texas. For a full generation, these Roman Catholic congregations, first under the pastoral provision and now in the ordinariate, have been worshiping and sharing parish life according to the Anglican tradition while proving themselves integral to the wider church. Apparently, this ecclesial experiment was judged promising, and though modest in side, worthy of wider application around the world, with provision for a more independent and permanent juridical structure. But the American contribution to this contemporary ecclesial development reaches deeper than the 1980 pastoral provision and stretches back into American religious history. I should like to comment on the American Anglican heritage in the quest for Catholic unity by way of sketching a few brief accounts of Catholic-minded Anglicans on these shores and assessing the distinctive character of the Anglican patrimony in its American expression. For good and for ill, American Anglicans have been in the vanguard. It was the American Episcopal Church that was the first in the Anglican Communion to fully manifest the disintegrative effects of the original Anglican schism from the Catholic Church by forsaking magisterial authority in favor of democratic revisions of doctrine and discipline, while sanctioning wholesale departures from the substantive content of Christian teaching. But at the same time, the American ethos of individualism, pluralism, congregationalism also afforded a certain space and a certain freedom for other Episcopalians to move in another direction and to recover their Catholic inheritance, both from resources within the Anglican tradition, principally the vestigial Catholicism preserved in the Book of Common Prayer, but also from the wider Catholic patrimony of theology, liturgy, music, architecture, and popular devotion. Theirs is a story of mavericks and forerunners, of creative minorities, those who mapped the way with a Catholic revival within the Episcopal Church, working in tandem with, but often independently of their like-minded brethren in Britain and in the British Commonwealth. And they did so to forge a vigorous high church movement and to shape the peculiar subculture of Anglo-Catholicism. Theirs is a story of refugees, fleeing the deficiencies and equivocations of their Protestant backgrounds and the liberalizing trends within their own ecclesial allegiance. But many of them went on to become pilgrims, walking the road to conversion and making significant contributions to the Catholic Church in these United States. And theirs is a story of pioneers who carried their Anglican character with them to lay their gifts at the feet of Peter and to be granted a special place at the table in the fullness of Catholic communion. Looking across the Atlantic, in the early decades of the 17th century, the English parson poet George Herbert wrote, "Religion stands on tiptoe in our land, ready to pass to the American strand," as he anticipated the Anglican evangelization of the English colonies in America. By religion, Herbert probably had in mind some version of his own gentle, genteel, and irenic Anglicanism, an imaginative, perhaps imaginary, via media between Genevan Calvinism and Roman Catholicism, a form of Christianity that was resolutely Protestant, yet richly sacramental, soundly biblical, but deeply patristic, dignified and austere, while retaining some elements of medieval piety. But the several forms of Christianity that actually crossed the Atlantic were quite different in character. Aside from a lethargic Anglican presence in Virginia and Maryland, and a meager scattering of frontier Anglicans in the Carolinas, those first Christians who settled the American colonies were, for the most part, Puritan fugitives from prelacy in the Church of England, and then refugees from the English Civil War and its aftermath, seeking freedom for their various types of separatism and dissent. With few exceptions, the first Anglicans on these shores were neither spiritually nor intellectually distinguished, and fell far short of Herbert's ideal. But, deprived of their own episcopate, while nominally governed by the Bishop of London, they were a hardy and independent lot. In Virginia, Anglican congregations chafed at the meddling of the royal governor, and responded to neglect from the Bishop of London's commissaries by appointing their own ministers and managing their own affairs. Thus was born the so-called vestry system, which gave American Anglicanism a distinctly congregationalist character, despite the later establishment of an Episcopalian church polity. At first, this de facto congregationalism was pragmatic and expedient, but in time it came to extend even to matters of fundamental theology. In the absence of a coherent body of doctrine beyond the notoriously vague articles of religion, lay vestries facilitated the stratification of parishes by churchmanship. Low and evangelical or Calvinistic, broad and liberal, high and ritualistic or Anglo-Catholic. You know the old rhyme, low and lazy, broad and hazy, high and crazy. Works pretty well. But long before the rise of an articulate high church movement, the seeds were sown for these and other important developments in the circumstances leading to the consecration of the first American Episcopalian bishop and the independence of the Episcopal Church from the Church of England. In 1722, in the Puritan stronghold of Connecticut, a colony most inhospitable to Anglicans, the rector of Yale College, Timothy Cutler, and 6 of his faculty, all Congregationalist ministers, announced that they had read, studied, and prayed themselves into the conviction that they were usurpers in the house of God, and must forthwith convert to the Anglican Church as more conformable to primitive Christianity and the Church of the Fathers. They had discovered for themselves, quite independently, something like the ideal of George Herbert and the thought of the 17th century Caroline divines, a version of Christianity otherwise virtually unknown in the colonies, even among putative Anglicans, and barely manifest at the time in Britain, except among a small handful of renegade Scottish bishops. These non-juring bishops, loyal to the Catholic Stuarts, refused to take the oaths of allegiance to William and Mary in 1689 following the Glorious Revolution, and hence stood out both politically and theologically against the prevailing Protestant settlement. Though neither these non-jurors, nor most of the Caroline divines who influenced them, nor yet the Connecticut churchmen themselves who walked in their footsteps, felt any particular sympathy for the papacy or any attraction to Roman Catholicism as such, they nonetheless marked the trajectory that would flower in the Oxford movement. 3 of the Connecticut converts were ordained to the Anglican priesthood and laid the foundations for the high church movement in American Anglicanism. The Connecticut churchmen and their followers dedicated themselves to the single-minded purpose of unifying American Anglicans, who were geographically scattered and religiously divided. And they did so by working toward the achievement of what they called a free and valid episcopate. They sought, in other words, not only bishops independent of the crown and the established Church of England, but bishops after the pattern of the early church, bishops like Athanasius and Hilary and Ambrose. In 1783, in the aftermath of the American Revolution, the clergy of Connecticut independently elected Dr. Samuel Seabury, himself the son of a Congregationalist minister, to embark for England to secure a bishop in apostolic succession for America. When the English Anglican hierarchy refused to confer the episcopate on him, Seabury went on to Scotland, where protracted negotiations with the non-juring bishops resulted in his consecration as the first American Anglican bishop in 1784, just 5 years before Pope Pius VI appointed John Carroll the first Catholic bishop of Baltimore. Already sharing the convictions of the non-jurors, Seabury also signed an agreement promising to advocate Scottish liturgical forms and Eucharistic theology for America, as opposed to the more strikingly Protestant variants found in the 1662 English Book of Common Prayer. While an incipient high church party thus emerged in Connecticut, of all places, different Anglican factions held sway in New York, in Pennsylvania, and in Virginia. Alarmed at the prospect of an American Episcopal Church with Jacobite sympathies, the Whig Parliament in London that had refused episcopal orders to Seabury quickly authorized the consecration of foreign bishops for America to neutralize this non-juring influence. Thus, an English succession was added to the Scottish lineage of Seabury with the ordination of Bishop William White for Pennsylvania, Bishop Samuel Provoost for New York, and shortly later Bishop James Madison for Virginia. These founding bishops of the Episcopal Church in America anticipated among them what were to become the 3 competing, incompatible theological orientations that have riddled American Anglicanism ever since. Where Seabury represented a high church position, White and Madison were more nearly low church in their decidedly Calvinistic sympathies, and Provoost, as a child of the Enlightenment, barely more than a deist, prefigured the broad church party. Averting schism, the 4 bishops only came together after much struggle and compromise when the First General Convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church in 1789 settled upon a republican constitution to forge fragile consensus and to perpetuate the episcopate that was so dearly bought. Lay delegates selected by congregational vestries would vote in equal number with the clergy in convention to elect by majority ballot all future candidates for ordination as bishops. By a grim irony of history, the Connecticut churchman's dream of a free and valid episcopate, conceived on a patristic model and utterly distinct from the role of English bishops as officers of the state, these hopes were dashed due to parliamentary maneuvering, incompatible theologies, and the inevitable compromise that resulted in exchanging the supremacy of the king for the supremacy of General Convention and church government by synodality. But if Seabury did not, indeed could not, secure for the fledgling American church his ideal of episcopacy, his influence was decisive and for Catholic-minded Anglicans most auspicious in shaping the distinctive liturgical character of the American Anglican Church. True to his word and principles, Seabury, the most liturgically literate of the four bishops, successfully promoted the 1764 Scottish Communion Office as the model for the Eucharistic rite and the first American Book of Common Prayer. Though still a product of compromise and the meddling of diverse theological perspectives, the 1789 American Book of Common Prayer is striking for its departures from the 1662 English Book of Common Prayer, particularly in its return, following Caroline and non-juring precedents, to the older and relatively more Catholic Eucharistic formulae found in the first English prayer book of 1549. This first vernacular English liturgy after the 16th century schism, cleverly, ambiguously devised by Thomas Cranmer, at least gestured toward continuity with the Catholic faith in noting that its service of Holy Communion is commonly called the Mass. The conservative Bishop of Winchester, at the time, in the 16th century, Stephen Gardiner, famously opined that Cranmer's initial handiwork could be understood as compatible with the traditional view of the Catholic Mass. But this sentiment provoked the Protestantizing Cranmer and others to fashion a less ambiguously Protestant liturgy in the next prayer book of 1552, the model for all subsequent English books of common prayer. Thus, from an early date, liturgy became for Anglicans a murky, muddy battlefield of hopes and fears, subtle interpretive maneuvers, and desperate wishful thinking, often concealing and displacing a fundamental reckoning with the nature of the Church herself as the sacrament of salvation. Without a developed ecclesiology, despite his idealism, Seabury showed himself a liturgical conservative, though he was certainly not a romantic crypto-Catholic, like so many of the later Anglicans who sought to claim him. Still, in shaping the American prayer book and the subsequent trajectory of liturgical revision in the Episcopal Church, he gave Anglicans on these shores a beautiful and stately body of liturgical texts in a noble hieratic English idiom that inspired deep attachment and nurtured an authentically sacramental sensibility. As later Episcopalians came to appreciate, the prayer book and its surviving Catholic calendar stimulated robust liturgical worship, and it also offered a communion service that stirred in many of the faithful who prayed according to its formularies a longing for the real presence and a faint glimmering of what it could mean to participate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The torch of the emergent High Church party passed from Seabury to the next great bishop of the Episcopal Church, John Henry Hobart. Consecrated as the third Episcopal Bishop of New York in 1816, Hobart combined evangelical zeal and Catholic principles to energize the Church in New York and throughout America with his countercultural summons to holiness and his lofty sense of the transformative power of the Church and the sacraments. But most interestingly, Hobart was a significant influence on the young John Henry Newman, who penned an astonishing article entitled The Church Principles of Bishop Hobart, just as Newman himself was being ordained a deacon in the Church of England. And thus Hobart becomes one of the unsung fathers of the Oxford movement and the call to Catholic truth that would light the Anglican communion afire and eventually help leave it in ruins. Much more could be said about the American reception of the Tracts for the Times that caused such dissension within the Church of England and the development of a vigorous high church movement, as well as the establishment of parishes, seminaries, religious orders, and sodalities of Catholic devotion across the American Anglican Church. And there is an illustrious history of significant converts from the Anglican tradition to the Catholic faith in the American legacy, beginning with St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, the very first American-born Catholic saint, issuing in the further conversion of two astonishing Episcopalian bishops, Levi Silliman Ives and Frederick Kinsman, who was the sponsor and visitor of the Anglican Order of the Greymoor Friars of the Atonement, who under the remarkable leadership of Father Paul Watson established the Octave of Prayer for Christian Unity in 1908, and their prayers were answered a year later when, on Bishop Kinsman's suggestion, they made their corporate submission to the Catholic faith and received the rare privilege of retaining their corporate identity in the Holy See, an identity that they retain to this day. Throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, before the Catholic movement in the Episcopal Church started to decline, owing mostly to the onslaught of theological liberalism, and indeed more recently the sexual revolution, Anglo-Catholics in America energetically built seminaries, founded parishes, revived monastic orders, and established priestly fraternities. And they did so with great ambition and alacrity. They hoped for eventual reunion with the Holy See. That hope persisted through the years, bursting into flames at times with the encouraging prospects ignited by the Malines conversations of the 1920s. And Dom Lambert Bodin, his apparent openness on the behalf of the Holy See to the idea of an Anglican identity reconciled to Rome, united but not absorbed, as he put it. Those discussions collapsed in 1925 when it became clear that the Anglican representatives in the dialogue could scarcely speak on behalf of their own fragmented, vociferous co-religionists. Hopes flashed again with the Second Vatican Council's renewed commitment to ecumenism, and in 1966 with the official visit of Michael Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury, to Pope Paul VI. At that meeting, the Pope commended the worthy patrimony of piety and usage proper to the Anglican Church, and thereby the phrase Anglican Patrimony entered the Catholic lexicon for the first time. And we could continue this narrative into the events that led to Pope John Paul II's pastoral provision for an Anglican common identity within the Catholic Church, and thence to Pope Benedict XVI's establishment of the ordinariates under Anglicanorum Coetibus. The pastoral provision was issued ad tempus non determinatum, as if it were a halfway house for recovering Anglicans. And it was subject to juridical modification. The experience of the Anglican youth parishes in America, coupled with petitions for unity from around the world, coalesced to move Pope Benedict to offer prospective converts and those who were already Catholics from that tradition a more secure, more permanent ecclesial home in the personal ordinariates. This Anglican experience, so fraught in its native English context and hobbled by establishment, was, I believe, serendipitously, perhaps even providentially, funneled into America, where it underwent its own winnowing, cleansing, and clarifying by Anglicans themselves in conditions of relative freedom. And now this same experience, carried over by Catholic converts, has been further tested and confirmed in obedience to Rome, under ecclesiastical authority and discipline, and amid the diversity of the Catholic Church herself, to issue in a model for living out the promise of Anglican patrimony in full communion with the Apostolic See. Now, after nearly 2 decades, 16 years, the ordinariates continue the work for the harvest of Anglicanorum Coetibus. The problem of discerning Anglican patrimony and Catholic communion takes on a different character when reconceived as an assured gift for evangelizing fruitfulness. And this gift, given, received, and shared, issues in a further challenge to ordinary Catholics themselves to function as yet another creative minority, to make good on the gift and to take their inheritance not as a museum piece, nor as an inheritance located in the past, nor even as a scholarly conundrum, but as an opportunity and summons for mission and for the salvation of souls. The essential recognition is that so-called Anglican patrimony is really just Catholic patrimony, albeit in a form strained through the ironies, anomalies, and ambiguities of the Anglican experience. That mingled experience, at once so attractive, yet so frustrating, has out of its very brokenness and incompleteness summoned souls to seek and appreciate the fullness of faith in unity under magisterial authority for evangelizing mission. Writing in 1936, Arthur Michael Ramsay, later the Archbishop of Canterbury, so warmly greeted by Pope St. Paul VI, put it well when he wrote the following: "For while the Anglican Church is vindicated by its place in history, with a strikingly balanced witness to gospel and church and sound learning, its greater vindication lies in its pointing through its own history to something of which it is a fragment. Its credentials are its incompleteness, with the tension and the travail in its soul. It is clumsy and untidy. It baffles neatness and logic, for it is sent not to commend itself as the best type of Christianity, but by its very brokenness to point to the universal church wherein all may live." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brand. Now we have some time for question and answer. I think we have about 15 minutes, and Dr. Tracy will have the microphone back there. Anyone who would like to ask a question, kind of form a line right there, and Dr. Brand will take your questions.
I'm so used to having to rush to the microphones.
Exactly.
I just get in
Everybody all
line,
at
and here
once,
I am.
Nothing more to be said, I suppose. No.
Thank you for your lecture, Doctor. My name is Lucas Coach. I am curious if you are involved or otherwise aware of engagement occurring now with Anglicans in the U.S. I'm thinking particularly the Anglican Church in North America. Most evangelical kind of iteration of Anglicans today. A lot of very thoughtful people and clergy in that movement. I know in some ways it's kind of a gateway to the Catholic Church. I'm proof of it.
Okay.
So welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know that there are informal contacts and some discussion between representatives of the Anglican Church in North America, the ACNA, and officials in the Curia of the Holy See. But these are purely informal, casual conversations at this point. And so far as I know, there is no discussion of institutional reconciliation or alignment, but rather the expectation is that there will continue to be a trickle of conversions to Rome, either as individuals or in some cases as groups, small groups, under the auspices of the apostolic constitution. In fact, the real novelty of Pope Benedict's overture for the sake of Christian unity is specifying groups for corporate identity. Because forever the church has received individuals coming on their own who convert and then find themselves completely absorbed, swallowed up in the Catholic Church. And there have long been dreams and hopes of institutional corporate realignment and reunion with entire ecclesial bodies. But the ecclesial bodies of the Anglican world, including, I have to say, the ACNA, are just too incoherent. There are too many swirling, incompatible theologies and dispositions. In some ways, the ACNA is evangelical, but there are plenty of self-described Anglo-Catholics. Some of their members approve the ordination of women. Others refuse the ordination of women. So who speaks for the ACNA? The ACNA does not and cannot speak with a single voice. So it's left to these little groups, right? A handful of parishioners and their priest. And now they have the mechanism and the means, if they are called and if they so desire, to seek reunion with the Holy See. But beyond that reality, I don't think anything has changed. In some sense, what Pope Benedict did with his apostolic constitution was call the bluff of Anglicans who for generations had been piously praying for unity and saying, oh, we would love to be, return to the mother church and whatnot. Here was the opportunity. They could take it. Some did. Many others did not. Anglo-Catholics are very good at trumpeting, preaching in principle, ecclesiastical authority and discipline, but they're not so good in living it out in practice. And that's the difference. I don't know if any of that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Sometimes I thought you did a great job bringing out how the strands of unity were sometimes coming from places one would not expect. And maybe the flip side is sometimes true in ecumenical relations where the expected venue of unity doesn't turn out quite to be as much as one would like.
Yeah.
You didn't say anything about Archic, and I wonder if you thought anything fruitful came out of that.
Yeah, well, I had, a couple of pages on Archic in here, but I realized I was going on a bit, so I just quickly left all of those out. The Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission started off with great hopes and expectation. It was an outgrowth, in fact, of that meeting between Archbishop Michael Ramsey and Pope Paul VI in 1966 on the occasion of the canonization of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. And in its first phase, commencing in 1980, it seemed to be moving along briskly. And in fact, many prospective Anglican converts to the Catholic Church were told by Catholics themselves, don't come, wait, let Archic play its way out. It will bring about true corporate reunion. But it immediately foundered on the fact that no one could speak definitively for this collection of Anglicans who could not even agree among themselves on fundamental principles of doctrine and discipline. Now, the first phase seemed very promising, the second phase less so. The ordination of women, frankly, in the 1970s in the United States and later in the 1990s in the Church of England and throughout the Anglican Communion, has essentially put the kibosh on any possibility of a corporate reunion that would recognize Anglican orders, which were otherwise anyway declared absolutely null and utterly void by Pope Leo XIII way back in 1897. And these discussions have continued in one form or fashion as a kind of polite dialogue where we can sip tea and talk about theology and agree to disagree or try to make common cause on social justice issues. But essentially it's been a dead end. And I don't foresee that mechanism acquiring the kind of hopeful momentum that it may once have had. And frankly, Pope Benedict may have recognized as much in pioneering an alternative, a mode of corporate reunion that's still corporate, but not aimed at aligning entire ecclesial bodies.
Thank you for your talk. I noticed during your talk that you described the popes were seeking to confirm a variant of the Latin rite
Yes.
that sought that used Anglican liturgical and spiritual traditions.
Yes.
So would you say that the ultimate goal of the patrimony is to create something similar to the Eastern Catholic churches, where it's like another hierarchy that answers to the Pope but is separate from it, or is it a new thing?
The answer is no. And this was made clear to all of us who were involved in the unfolding of the Apostolic Constitution and the canonical norms that went with it. It was emphatic from the beginning that the ordinariates would be part of the Latin Rite. They would not be churches sui juris, churches in their own right, like the Eastern Catholic churches happen to be, precisely because the Anglican experience began as a schism from the Latin Church within Western Europe. And for the healing of the schism, it's only right and proper that it should return to the Latin Church and to the Roman Rite. And thus, our liturgical provision is recognized as a variant, a use, a form of the Roman Rite, on par with, say, the Ambrosian Rite or the Mozarabic Rite or the Dominican Rite or the rites of other particular religious orders. But we're very much under the discipline of the Roman Rite, and particularly in its modern expression. We have prefacing our missal the general instruction of the Roman Missal, the same general instruction that regulates the modern Roman Rite. But we get a special rubrical directory that derogates in specific ways from the norms of the general instruction in view of our particular patrimony, which shapes an experience of Mass that is very much grounded in the language and formularies of the Book of Common Prayer, but which features at its heart the Roman canon, the preeminent Eucharistic prayer of the Latin Rite, in a resonant hieratic English, including also features of the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine or extraordinary form of the liturgy, but all imported by way of Anglican missals developed in the 19th and 20th century, whereby Anglicans, seeking to make up for the deficiencies of their own Protestant service of worship, undertook wholesale beautiful translations of the Roman Missal to give Anglicans prayers at the foot of the altar, the last gospel, the offertory prayers of the traditional Latin Mass. This is now all part of the patrimony, and it suggests some intriguing implications and possibilities for the future development of the Roman Rite. But that's more than I want to dare speculate about tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Brandt. I really appreciated the focus you gave on American history.
Well, thank you.
One question that I
Because I could have
had.
talked about English history,
It's
and
true.
that's
It's
fascinating,
true.
but everyone knows that story.
One question I had regarding American history, though, is if the numbers that I looked at were correct, the ordinariate in America is significantly larger than the ordinariate in, say, Britain or
Yes.
or Australia. Is that because of our history on this side of the ocean, or is it because we just have a larger population?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, it is because, you know, we do have a larger population, a greater expanse. But you're absolutely right. In fact, you picked up on what I wanted to indicate. There's something about the dynamic vitality and freedom with which the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church developed in America, both for bad, for ill. I mean, it really went crazy. It went off the rails, but it afforded this kind of freedom and independence for the development of what I described as that centripetal motion back to Rome. That, and Americans, quite frankly, have a kind of entrepreneurial spirit and a can-do attitude. We can roll up our sleeves and build parishes from scratch and raise buildings and fund seminarians. Those things just have not happened in comparable measure in England or Australia, or scarcely at all in Canada. In part because Anglicans in England, coming out of the established church, are accustomed to essentially government provision of the funding of their ecclesial endeavors by ancient endowments. And there's just not that kind of independent mindedness. And all the lovely old churches and cathedrals are in the hands of the Church of England, with no hope or expectation anytime soon that Catholics will get them back. And the English ordinariate has yielded an impressive number of convert priests. But by and large, those convert priests have been put to work in regular mainstream Catholic dioceses, with scarcely any possibility of founding, forging, starting from scratch, parishes made up of lay converts. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and there are signs of life and vigor. And then a place like Australia is just so aggressively secular and anti-Christian. And there's a good bit of anti-Catholic sentiment. And insofar as there's any vital Anglicanism in Australia at all, it tends to be very low evangelical. In fact, neo-Calvinistic, centered around Sydney. So there are all sorts of complex reasons. But I do think there's an important way in which America has not only shaped the way, but America offers prospects for developing the potential of the ordinariates that are, quite frankly, challenged in the other ordinariates. Yeah. But great question, yes.